Hi, this is Misha, and today's video is on a really neat gun with a ton of history behind it. But it's going to be mostly me talking. There's not a whole lot about this gun that's unique. This is the Israeli Mauser Kar.98 chambered for 7.62 NATO. These guns have like I said, a really long history. But just since we'll be talking about this quite a bit, I thought I'd bring out some other Israeli IDF eye candy for you to look at while I'm talking. We've got a couple of pistols here. We've got a Beretta 1951, which is, this one actually did come out of Israel. These were used in the 50s. And we've got a FN high power, again another Israeli gun. This came out, they used this in the 80s. This particular one anyway. We have a semi-automatic IMI Uzi Model A with the original pattern wood buttstock on it. And we have my trusty Israeli FAL light barrel. Why not? Sometimes called the Romat. So yeah, I thought I'd just bring that out to fill the table up. Alrighty, so the Israeli Mauser. Right after World War II, an organization called Haganah was fighting for Jewish independence in the area at that time called Palestine, today which is modern-day Israel. Now, Britain had had a mandate to, organize, maintain, police Palestine since the First World War. So the British government was the official authority there. Now, after World War II, the UN was going to partition Palestine into an Israeli Jewish state and a Palestinian Muslim Arab state. But this didn't work. Some of the Israelis, or I should say the Jews at the time, the Jewish population, wasn't in favor of this, and some of the Arab population. Basically, both parties kind of wanted all or nothing. And looking back at its sources and documentation from the time, it seems like the Arab population was a little more staunch about this than the Jewish population. But that's neither here nor there. That's old politics. But we have Haganah as the major Jewish group fighting for independence, 1945, 1946, but there were other smaller ones. They're mostly fighting Arabs, Palestinians, but they are going up against the British on occasion. They do exchange some shots. Now, they have some members that are refugees from Europe. We have some people in Haganah that were once served in the British military or the US military or even the French resistance, so they have military training. What they don't have are a lot of small arms or ammunition for said small arms. So in 1946, Operation Bullock begins, and that is Haganah's attempt to get guns out of Europe. And luckily for them at the time, 1946, there are a lot of surplus guns floating around Europe. Mostly old Nazi stuff, but a lot of Enfields, M1 Grands, M1 Carbines, Mosin Nagants, everything. A major war had just been fought. So they were successful in getting several thousand guns out of Europe. Ammunition was still a problem, and they still didn't have near enough guns to equip all their soldiers, all their people. But it was a start. Now in 1947, Haganah actually approaches the Brno factory in Czechoslovakia and asks if they can purchase some guns off of them. And this is a very clandestine thing because there's an arms embargo against Palestine, and again, Haganah is not the official government or military body, it's the British. So this is pretty well illegal. But Czechoslovakia needs money after the war, and they have a bunch of guns. There are a few different sources for them. For one thing, the Brno factory, which the Germans called Brunn, was basically forced to make Mauser Kar.98ks during World War II for the Germans. So they have those, they have the production facility, they have lots of parts. Additionally, a large German army surrendered in Czechoslovakia in 1945 and laid down their arms there. And finally, a lot of guns came from the USSR, the Soviet Union. After World War II, they had captured hundreds of thousands of German weapons, and some of them made their way to Czechoslovakia. So they needed money. They had plenty of guns. Israel had a few money. I shouldn't say Israel. I keep saying that. I'm sorry. Haganah, the Jews, had some funds. They could buy the guns. And at the same time, believe it or not, Stalin in Russia was in favor of an independent Israeli Jewish nation in the Middle East. This was around 1947. And at that time, he thought having a secular Jewish nation in the Middle East would be a good thing because at that time, Egypt, Jordan, and Syria were pretty cozy with the West, especially Syria. So he thought he could get in good with the Jewish nation and have his own influence in the Middle East. Obviously, as we know, this didn't last long. So for the time, Stalin was in favor, and he encouraged, or should we say even ordered, Czechoslovakia to take the deal. He even gave them additional ammunition captured from Nazi Germany for them to repackage and sell. So the Czechs began working on this contract. It was officially signed in January of 1948, and they were going to deliver 4,500 K98s, or as they called them, P-18s, to Israel. Now at this time, this batch is mostly either leftover and refurbished German guns from the war, or they're guns that were assembled after the war but using a lot of leftover German parts. The first ones would be delivered in March via airplane, again very clandestine, and then in April the bulk of the order would be delivered by ship, which was running a blockade set up by the British. Well, the British mandate would end around the same time, and they would pull out, leaving Haganah to form part of Israel and eventually turn into the IDF. The problem is, though, as soon as the British pulled out, Israel was attacked on virtually all sides. Pretty much every Muslim Arab nation went at them. Egypt, Iran, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, they all attacked Israel. So they were fighting. At the same time, while the Brits were gone, the arms embargo remained. So throughout that year, Czechoslovakia would continue to send guns clandestinely to Haganah, which was becoming the IDF. And the last shipments from that order would happen around October of the year. In total, about 34,000 Mausers would make it over. The earlier ones that the IDF, the Jewish military, would obtain were leftover German, as I said. The later ones, though, as the year went on, would be newly produced in Czechoslovakia, albeit on leftover German tooling. And the Czechs would call these VZ98Ns. They would have this larger trigger guard called the winter trigger guard. This is a single piece stamped part here, the floor plate, the trigger guard. We don't have the locking screws, we just have the major screws. Other than that, pretty well the same gun. Now at this time, of course, all of these are still an 8mm Mauser, 7.92 by 57. They also sent Israel millions upon millions of rounds of ammunition, as well as some leftover MG34s and I'm sure some MG42s as well. So they were a pretty good arms supplier. And this is why you'll see some guns like this one that have the Czechoslovakian markings on the receiver and the Czechoslovakian crest. But you also see guns from the earlier batch, which are a mix of German guns. Most of the Nazi German guns that were sent over were from 1944, 1945, towards the end of the war, but plenty of earlier guns from 1940, 1942 also came over. Now, a lot of people have said that the Israelis would purify these guns by removing the Waffen amps. And then a lot of others have correctly stated that this wasn't true. This was not a program That said, the Brno factory would sometimes scrub these during its refurbishment, and other times individual Israeli Jewish soldiers would scratch out the Waffen-Amps. So while the IDF never took a program to do it, some others did. Obviously the ones that Brno did would be machined off professionally and reblued over. The ones that a soldier would have defaced would just have like chisel marks or screwdriver or bayonet marks over them, so very, very obvious. So that's how the first wave of Mausers got into Israel. 1949, the War of Independence is over, and Israel has defeated its enemies. And in 1950, they approach FN, Fabrique Nationale, in Belgium, to build more Mausers for them. And this would be an official, sanctioned, legal contract. They would begin negotiations, and by 1952 and 1953, the order would be delivered. I looked, I could not get a number for how many guns were delivered, but more interestingly, the caliber is a little bit debated. Most would assume that these were an 8mm Mauser, although some sources claim this was the first batch to be purpose-built for 7.62 by 51. At the time known as T65 cartridge, later to be known as NATO. And while I don't think this is likely, it is technically possible. If you'd said it was any other factory besides FN, I would say BS. But because FN had been working with the T65 cartridge for its FALs, which would eventually evolve into a gun like this right here, they did have early access to it. But I've looked online at other 1950 model FNs, and most are in 30-06 or 8mm. There is one small batch from Morocco that was made later on in 7.62 NATO, so yes, FN factory did produce them in that caliber, but this seems to be a later 1950s contract that happened after the Israeli. So while it is possible that the FN Israeli Mausers were originally in 7.62 NATO, it doesn't seem likely, because when they were negotiating for this contract, 1951 we'll say, it was a very new cartridge, almost still in the experimental stages. But since the rifles were delivered 52, 53, it is technically possible, although not probable. They were probably still an 8mm. If anyone knows further, I'd love to hear from you. I looked and looked for a while, and I really just couldn't find anything concrete. So I'm going to have to kind of go with the logical conclusion that 8mm was it. This was the last major batch that Israel would get of Mausers. They would get a few small batches, a couple of thousand here and there from other sources. For example, Ethiopia, also Sweden. But those were the three major batches you'll see. German World War II guns, surplus, newly assembled guns from Brno, and newly built guns from FN. It's worth noting that the FN guns were built from all new parts on an all new production line, so they were the newest and most official. They will also have the IDF crest on top of the receiver. But this one obviously just has the Czech crest because it's not an FN. So that was the history of how the Mauser got into Israel. In 1954, they started to look at the FAL, firing what was before the T65 cartridge, which became 7.62 NATO, and they began to receive the FAL in 1955. Now in 1956, a couple of things happened. For one thing, there was the Suez Crisis, the Suez conflict or war. The K98 in Israel had seen heavy use in the War of Independence, obviously. And in 1956, it was still in widespread use, but they were transitioning away from 8mm, and it was a bolt-action rifle. In the War of Independence, that was okay because it went up against Enfields, M1 carbines, and MAS 36s. But by 1956, the Arab nations were starting to be equipped with AK-47s, SKSs, FN-49s, and other automatic rifles. So this was becoming an obsolete gun in 1956, but they did use it, again, still in 8mm. They used it against some they used it with some FALs that were coming over from FN at the time. And they also used it alongside the Uzi, which was designed in Israel in 1950, 1951, and started to go into service around 53, 54. We have more videos on the Uzi, so, you can check those out. But it's a contemporary gun, and it did see a lot of use in the Suez conflict. At the same time, because of the adoption of the FAL, and because they were starting to run somewhat low on 8mm, they decided to undertake a program to rechamber their existing K98 Mausers to fire 7.62 NATO, and that's where a gun like this came from. Now, luckily, after the conclusion of the Czech contract in 1948, the following year, Israel obtained an entire Mauser production line from the Czechs, from Brno. Now, they thought about making their own guns, but it wasn't economical. They had enough. Surplus guns were cheap. But what they ended up using this production line for was to make replacement parts for the older guns and to make the parts for the conversions. For example, they would make the new 7.62 caliber barrels. They would make modified magazine followers for the shorter cartridge. They'd continue to make replacement parts, of course, and they would often make new stocks out of beechwood. The program would start off kind of slow, 1956, but they would do several guns. But by 1958, it was in full scale, and they were converting all guns, FN, Czech, German, Swedish even, the Ethiopians. They would break down the original guns to their components. They would clean them, refurbish them, refinish them, and then reassemble them from common parts bins. This is why Israeli reworked Mausers are rarely, if ever, basically never completely all matching, because they were intentionally stripped down and kind of reassembled from parts. Very similar to the US's program for the M1 Garand and M1 Carbine around and after Korea. They would actually keep this program up until at least 1967, by which time nearly all Mausers in IDF service would have been converted over to fire 7.62 NATO 308. Also in 1967, 6 Days War. And again, the Israeli Mauser, and a new caliber now, would be called on for service. Again, it was mostly sent for reservists and second-line troops, but it was used. And it was used by the IDF paratroopers, some. The FAL by that point had been proving itself okay, but not always 100% reliable in the desert environment, so some Israelis felt it was better to have a reliable bolt action than it was to have an unreliable automatic rifle. And since they all shot the same cartridge, why not? One more time, in 1973, with the Yom Kippur War, this would be called on for service. And by this time, it really was a second line, third line, rear echelon even unit. I mean, not unit, but weapon. It was issued to communications units and other troops who weren't expected to see combat, but, give them a gun just in case shit went really bad. But, it was on its way out. Not only was the FAL in full service then, the Galil was being used in early versions, and Israel had captured quite a few AK-47s used by the Arab nations, and I'm sure many, many other guns. This is where the PLL AK kits came from in early 2000, actually, the Israeli. And they would redeploy them because they worked in the deserts. Well, after the Yom Kippur War, they would finally officially surplus these critters out. Now, the Israeli gun is pretty well similar to any other large ring 98 action Mauser. Has a few small differences, though. For one, there's not a cleaning rod channel. This is a replacement Israeli stock, by the way. There's not a cleaning rod channel. It does take a Mauser type bayonet, though. They would use either the standard Mauser bayonet without the ring, the muzzle ring, or they would manufacture their own in-house with the ring, or they would take old German bayonets and add the rings to them. Either way, they like muzzle rings, and I don't blame them. The front sight is also a little different. It's secured with a pin to make it not slide off as easily. These did have front sight protectors. Mine's missing it, sorry. We have Kriegsmodel style stamped bands on a lot of these. But instead of being attached by screws, the front is attached by a pin, and the rear is attached by a spring, half spring here, kind of like on a K98. Standard upper handguard, standard stock, except now we do have the return of finger grooves, grasping grooves. Again, kind of like the K98, but unlike the K98. We already looked at the magazine and its differences and the larger trigger. Moving back, we do not have a takedown disc in the stock. Instead, they use the Kriegsmodel hole in the cupped butt plate, which works the same and is probably a lot cheaper, and maybe it makes the stock a little stronger too. So those are the differences. Again, they put a 7.62 barrel in it. They were able to use the same 8mm bolt because the face was the same size. The magazine follower was shortened and a little filler block was added to the front right there to keep the cartridges from sliding forward. That's something that some people who've converted Mausers from 8mm to 308 have forgotten to do in the past, so good on them, because they actually made these guns for use, not just because. But anyway, to wrap this story up, in the 70s they started to surplus these out. They sent them to several allied nations of Israel, but probably the biggest one was Guatemala. And Israel and Guatemala, believe it or not, had always had a pretty friendly relationship. When Israel was petitioning to be a nation, Guatemala cast the deciding vote in the UN to let them in. So they were appreciative of that. The first batches of Israeli Mausers were actually sent to Guatemala in 1957. Then they would send another small batch in 1967 to Guatemala. But in 1977, running through about 1983, they would send a lot. Probably all told, at least 20,000 more went to Guatemala. These were shipped in the 80s, especially with Galil rifles. They were kind of just a cover. Guatemala really didn't need them, but they put them to work. They sent them to reserve units, second line units, police officers, and they would themselves give them away to some allies. Some have turned up in Colombia. The Nicaraguan rebels in the 80s would end up with some of these, thanks to Guatemala. They would get around South America quite a bit. Other Israeli Mausers would be imported into the USA via Arms Corp, who around 1985 started bringing them over directly from Israel. And these guns tend to be in pretty good shape because they're straight out of Israeli stockpiles. Sometimes they have a little bit of a beat-up external finish, but a great bore. So other times they look brand new because they were refurbished towards the end of the program and never issued. So that was the first wave that came into the USA. Then around 2000, Century Arms started bringing some guns in from South America, which they've been doing really up until quite recently. Some look fine, but a lot of them were completely thrashed. I've got a story to tell, and then we'll wrap the video up, but I think you'll find the story amusing. A friend used to work for Century, and back in the 90s and early 2000s, he would go abroad for Century and look at possible collections they might purchase. When he went down to look at the Israeli Mausers in South America, he told me this. He said they were stored in literally a cave cut into the side of a mountain, so not exactly the driest environment to begin with, and they were just stacked up like cordwood, just stacked on top of each other. And once a year, for inventory purposes, the soldiers would be told they needed to take all the Mausers out, count them, check serials, and then put them back in. So what they do, they would have a bucket chain, essentially, of guys running back into the cave and out into the rainforest. They would toss Mauser from guy to guy, literally toss them. Sometimes they would catch them, sometimes they would drop them on the stone floor. And then they would toss them outside in the rainforest in a big pile. They would do their paperwork, and when it was all done, they would repeat the process in reverse. They would toss them from guy to guy back into the cave and into piles. The problem is, they were outside for several hours. It's a rainforest. It probably rained at some point. Even if they didn't get rained on, they probably got dropped at least at one time during the whole process. So this is why so many of the Israeli Mausers out of South America are rusty and have cracked furniture. Some of them, believe it or not, even had bent barrels because they were left kind of sitting up against something for so long, and plus all the other mistreatment, the barrels actually kind of got bent. Not by much, but enough to throw accuracy completely off. So I thought that was an interesting story. But yeah, the last of the Israeli Mausers kind of came out of South America via Century a couple of years ago and have been sold on the U.S. market. For a long time, these were kind of not really appreciated. These are the cheapest Mausers. Collectors weren't interested because they did not have history. They'd been refurbished, reworked, didn't have their original barrels. But in more recent years, people have begun to appreciate them. These guns have a boatload of history. German history, Czech history, even the history of the Soviet-West relations in the late 40s, and all the wars that they were used in. I mean, at least 4 major conflicts and several minor skirmishes, and they have a lot to go for them. Plus, they're in a caliber that we can easily get that's relatively affordable and we can shoot. So, all in all, the Israeli Mauser, to me, is one of the neatest Mausers out there, at least outside of some of the German and some of the others. Then again, I'm a little wacky. I think the Russian capture guns are kind of neat too for their history as well. But yeah, really appreciate you tuning in. Wanted to give a reasonably thorough history of the Israeli K98 and 7.62 NATO. If you have any questions or comments or want to talk about your own gun, please post it below. If you like the video, please click. If you haven't subscribed yet, we really appreciate it if you could find the time to do so. This is Misha, and we'll catch you next time.